Oh, all my relations. Welcome to another program, Eagle and Condor, here at BAVC Media, based in San Francisco. And you can watch this and tell your friends. You can watch this online at sfc.tv or go to the website for AIM West, and that's at aim-west.org. And that's on Sundays from 4 to 5. Tell your friends and tune in. And today, my relatives, we have very special guests. That's Wakíŋyaŋ LaPointe and his brother Thorne. And I first met them having credentialed them as part of AIM West delegates to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And among that delegation included their father, Lemoyne LaPointe, and several others. My relatives, I've invited Wakíŋyaŋ and his brother Thorne to talk to us about water and the sacredness of water. Water is life. And more recently, the topic of water has been brought up at the United Nations, but yet, as you'll find, there's very little water regulations, whether it's at the national level or even at the international level. And water is a special resource that, with everything else diminishing, water is among those, perhaps. So it'll be a very valuable source for many people, many countries. So we're talking about the possibility of it already happening, and that is water wars. Water wars have been going on for many years, over the centuries, in fact. There's different categories of water rights, whether it's territorial, even as countries have them today. But there are several categories of those water rights. And I've invited Wakíŋyaŋ and Thorne to talk to us about water as they perceive it, both at the national organizing level, as they're based out of Minnesota, but also on the international level, and bringing attention to the water as a source and of concern to the coming generation. So, Wakíŋyaŋ LaPointe, welcome to Eagle and Condor. If you would please introduce yourself, where you're coming in from, and like that, please.
Almatakiapi, Dion Wakíŋyaŋ Kapelo, Wakíŋyaŋ Machapi, Sichon Hu, Lakota, Kamakochiki, Matahan. My name is Wakíŋyaŋ LaPointe, and I'm glad to be here today. And I remember the time we first went to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues with Tony there. And since then have kind of did a little bit deeper dive into different forums with AIM West. And so some other news just recently surfaced as well with UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples for our initiative that I'll share more about as we get into it.
Oh, very good. And we have also Thorne, your brother. Thorne, can you come on and introduce yourself as well?
Hello, relatives. My Lakota name is Broken Lade. My English name is Thorne LaPointe. And we're here to talk about Niki Wakíŋyaŋ, that is, water is sacred, one of original instructions as well as a mandate that we really carry forward at the sacredness of water, and really examining and taking analysis on that futurity, that trajectory of our water now into the future. So today's an honor to be here on this show and to be here with Tony. Tony has been a mentor to us in the international system. So with that,
thank you, Thorne. And Wakíŋyaŋ, you and I and Thorne and many others were together at New York at this recent United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the 22nd session. And under AIM West and Agenda Item 3, Wakíŋyaŋ, you read a statement on water. Wakíŋyaŋ, if you can tell us, or Thorne, your source of gathering that information for that statement and the plans that you have for Minneapolis area in August, a conference on water.
Yeah, each year in the past and probably every other year, we have hosted what we call the Wakíŋyaŋ Summit or MKW Summit. And we host that each year in August and invite Indigenous peoples, youth, and environmental water organizations that are Indigenous-led to attend. And the culmination of that summit ends with a MKW Summit report that basically outlines stakeholder innovations for the future of water that Indigenous peoples and youth believe can make the most difference for the future of water. And that's important because we want to hear what Indigenous communities are saying and what they envision, and also the issues that they're experiencing around water. And so water issues are so complex that it's very difficult to address, for one organization to address every issue. And what we can do is partner with other Indigenous organizations working across different sectors of Indigenous water rights and bring them together in the MKW Summit. And so a lot of what we heard at the past MKW Summit in 2022 was what we shared in the international intervention at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York City this past April. And so it wasn't just us developing a statement. It was informed by our conversations with other Indigenous peoples and youth working on water issues across diverse sectors that include things up to water infrastructure, water resource departments for tribal nations, as well as Indigenous youth working around and taking on Indigenous water rights in their own communities to test their waters and then find their own solutions after that, as well as Indigenous scholars who have outlined concepts for Indigenous peoples and youth to use as tools towards looking at what they can do for the future of Indigenous water rights in their own communities through their own cultural worldviews, but also through their own indigenized tools of Indigenous water justice and as well as Indigenous water governance. And so part of our goal this year was to ensure that key innovations in that MKW Summit report outlined by Indigenous peoples and youth were heard at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues on that global stage, and that we elevated their innovations to the highest level that we could within our own organization as Wakíŋyaŋ or MKW. And so we met with some of our MKW co-conveners as well as partners who are working on Indigenous water rights issues to host a what I call a global dialogue or a panel on Indigenous water justice, global collaboration, and dismantling water colonialism. And in that dialogue that Tony might show now or in the weeks to come, you'll hear other Indigenous youth speaking about, what they foresee for the future of water, but also as they tackle hard and tough issues around water that are the result of essentially water colonialism that began with the theft of Indigenous waters in this country. And when that occurred, what happened ultimately to today is that these dominant and prominent Western water institutions now hold much of the wealth, power, and resources and control the global dialogue around policy, solution-oriented approaches, and forums on water. And so essentially in many of these sectors, Indigenous peoples and youth are locked out of these sectors from having a voice on water rights in a broader community. That doesn't mean that we don't have our own internal solution-oriented approaches around tribal or Indigenous water policies, because many Indigenous communities do. And those are the examples that many of these external communities and water institutions are pulling from also. And so there's a lot of connections to be made. And that was the point of going to the UN, is to start making more of those connections on a global level, to bring those back down and ground those into the MKW Summit this year, August 15th through the 17th. So it's a lot of organizing, a lot of relationship building, and just a lot of research, I would say, to inform MKW and ourselves in organizing around water and making sure that we're informed and as we build these relationships.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I wanted to ask you, Wakíŋyaŋ Thorne, on your people today as corporate farming, corporate agriculture. It's water for profit, and have gotten away from it as a living source and more as a commodity to be exploited. And your view is it's a living element. Can you elaborate further on that, and how do you contextualize it to educate the people that you're addressing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very sort of immense question that of water sort of futurities and policies that many Indigenous communities are looking at this time, especially at the local level. And so part of water colonialism and even just the contemporary history we're in is that many industries or corporate sectors that work around environment or water view water and nature as a resource, something to be consumed, something of a quantity or amount to be used for human purposes and consumption. And so this came and was further sort of entrenched by the concept of property, which individualized almost everyone's relationship with the natural world. And so when many indigenous peoples have this relationship with water that sees water as a living relative. And so as we begin to sort of nourish that relationship and reawaken it in different regions, what's occurring is this conversation around water policy. How in what ways does this qualitative relationship begin to inform water policy at the local to national levels? And so part of this history by Indigenous communities and water is that water relationships and water rights, so to speak, back pre-colonial times in some cases were held collectively in common with one another as Indigenous communities, rather than using the concept of property. So one Indigenous person didn't own this amount of water over other Indigenous peoples. Instead, it was a common responsibility to look at water as a relative and to take care of that relative. And so it's about now, how do we begin to integrate these values and historical key points back into contemporary water policies, back into our relationship and frameworks, such as those used by water resources departments or water departments of Indigenous communities. How in managing water, how do we return to sort of, in some cases, a water co-governance system that uplifts Indigenous knowledge in the conservation and restoration of water? So, what I mean by that is that there was once many Indigenous communities who held water through co-governance systems. What that meant was that we didn't just replicate this Western water management system that left it up to the experts, so to speak. Community members had a critical role in the future of their water rights and the development of their nation's water rights. And today, when we replicate Western water management systems, what happens is those community members are oftentimes excluded from their water rights in the future, developing the future of those water rights, even for cultural purposes that those cultures depend on to exist. And so there's many different facets that this Indigenous water rights conversation exists around. And so it's so complex that what we choose to take on has to be tended to with a lot of care, just as we begin to nourish that relationship with our water relatives. The same holds true for this type of organizational work that we want to begin to advance. And so I'll stop it there. There's so much more to it, but I'll stop it there and see if Thorne wants to add anything. Hopefully we're not coming short on time here.
Yes, please, Thorne, if you want to elaborate further, you have any points, perspective on that?
Yes. So for us, we really look towards original instructions as Indigenous peoples, traditional ecological knowledge. And, a lot of Indigenous peoples around the world, the commonality that you will see is that water has been a primary identity shaper to the national character of our Indigenous nations. And, the question of our times, well, there's many, one I always thought about was, how do we create an active water sovereignty citizenry, and to really line this timeline up onto the seventh generation for a more realistic and more powerful succession plan for the next generations now and into the future. And there are many methods that, indigenous peoples around the world are going around. They have this vision, they have this traditional ecological knowledge, and they're trying to install, the original instructions for the protection and, the preservation of water 7 generations ahead. They're trying to install it through their constitutions. They're trying to install it through their water management policies, to their codes and ordinances. They're trying to install it by enshrining the personhood of water, just like our Maori relatives, or just like they did in the Constitution of Bolivia. Just like some of the relatives now are examining and exploring how we might do that, within our own national borders as indigenous nations. And we're really taking this sovereignty, analysis to the next level. And it's a timely one because we understand that water, the final analysis, will be the primary issue of all issues. And so this is some of the conversations that we're fortunate to have with our indigenous relatives. And this is, also part of the theme this year is Indigenous water justice, global collaboration, and dismantling water colonialism. Because too often, water colonialism and capitalism, they reduce and atomize everything down to a bottom line, and that includes our water and our lands. And for us, we're trying to figure out ways of how do we create policies that shift from a transactional basis to a relational basis. And that is, I guess you could say in a cycle, and that, what we take, we could put back, and that the environment has the ability to regenerate all of that. And at the same time, to stop, this water theft, this water colonialism, this destruction of the earth and our waters from transnational corporations, and as well as governments who, just turn the other way when this is all happening in our traditional lands, for Lakotas, our treaty lands. So yeah, it's a good gathering that we're going to have, water justice in Rapid City on August 15th to the 17th, and we're going to have a lot of indigenous water experts, champions, and leaders, and particularly the voices of our youth we want to lift up during that time to really explore the innovations and untried possibilities.
Thank you very much, Thorne, and very well said. And for our listeners, for that August water conference that you're organizing in Minnesota, we'll be posting that on our website and at aim-west.org to keep people posted on that. And I want to thank you both, you young gentlemen, for having the foresight to begin advocating this at that international level, such as you did, and as you've been there since 2014 at the UN, and continue to build that momentum with the coalition of the MKW. And what for our listeners, the video that we will be seeing after this interview includes 2 additional individuals who are working with you in setting up and advancing the advocacy on the water security, water concern, and water organizing. Indeed, and just to you mentioned from transactional connecting that, making it more personal and individual to people, the sacredness of water. And when we talk about that lakes and rivers also have memories, that it sounds like an abstraction, but when you think about it, rivers and lakes dry up and they come back, et cetera. And here in California, for example, there's so much rain all across the country, there's no more drought, but there's an excessive rain. Climate change has brought on a lot of ice and snow, and is still melting. And a lot of the reservoirs are full. They have to release water. Water is releasing itself naturally. And sure enough, those old rivers that were dried up, those old lakes that were dried up, some of those lakes were dried up as a result of the dam projects that were constructed to hold back these mighty rivers, and but it's all coming back, and that water is coming back to those sources. That to me is really makes it clear how water does have memories also, for us to get that context of it being a living source as opposed to a commodity, as corporate American agriculture has done in the past. So I want to thank you both for coming on. And also, I just want to recommend for our listeners a book by Vandana Shiva, foremost environmentalist, and who this book is from 2002, but it's very relevant even today. And there's still no global regulations on these water conflicts that are potentially can get to a bigger conflict. But pick up this book if you can, my relatives. All right, we're going to go into that video now. I want to thank you both. All my relations.
No, Doksha. Hello, relatives. My Lakota name is Broken Leg. My English name is Thorne LaPointe. Sichanghu Lakota from Rosebud, South Dakota. Today we are joined together by some very honored guests. Today's theme, the panel is Indigenous Water Justice, Global Collaboration and Dismantling Water Colonialism. At this time, I would like to go down, no particular order. Maybe we'll start from the left. And I'll ask you to introduce yourself in the way you see fit, and want to know what brought you to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues 22nd session this year. So we can start now.
My name is Wakíŋyaŋ LaPointe. I've been attending the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since 2014. And in 2016, RTYA and partners, Indigenous Peoples and Youth, announced the Wakíŋyaŋ Indigenous Water Decade. And with that, an MKW summit to bring together Indigenous peoples to look upstream for Indigenous-led water innovations that could present the most difference for the future of water and all life. And at this time, we're here at the 22nd session of the UNPFII, building collaboration, building conversations, and identifying innovations to bring back with us to the 2023 MKW Summit occurring August 15th through the 17th.
Hello everyone, I greet you with a warm handshake. My name is Ampo Towi Jensen. I'm from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and I'm a Lakota. I come from the Kiuksa Tiushpai. And what was the other question?
Just what brought you to the UNPFI this year?
Okay, thank you. I'm here as a youth delegate for the Black Hills Sioux Nation Council. And so I come here bringing to light issues on the Black Hills and the mining and the water issues that we have. I've also done previous environment health research on the impacts of that mining that happened and broke our treaties in 1868. So I'm here to continue that work that Lakota people have started way back then, and here with my relatives. We'll be
Ambo Wastich, Ambone Nino Washtich, the Tonkawa Gichi Wacha, Toganaki Tancha, me and Gibi, Ishnish, me and they watched it. Good day, my relatives. I introduce myself in my Iarhe Nakota language from Minithni Oyade in southern Alberta of the Iarhe, the mountain people, also known as Morley, Alberta, Nakota. And my English name is Daryl Kootenay, and born and raised in the mountains in Canada. And today I'm here at the United Nations Permanent Forum, a part of the Nakota Youth Council, an organization, a grassroots youth movement that has been a part of a journey of bringing more and more Nakota youth, but expanding that to other youth in our territory to come into the Permanent Forum and learn about the UN mechanisms and processes, and to help bring that knowledge and experience that they receive here in relation to their rights as Indigenous peoples and to the land, and bringing that home to generate and develop ideas that we can act upon in our local community. So I'm here today with some youth from my community and other youth from Ontario, and just happy to be here.
Oh, Wopila. So we get into the second question. Again, this panel is on Indigenous water justice, global collaboration, and dismantling water colonialism. So we know water has been a primary identity shaper to the national character for many Indigenous nations around the world and across Turtle Island. So this question we go into is, at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, what types of opportunities for water and land rights have you noticed for Indigenous peoples and youth? Again, at the UNPFII, what types of opportunities for water and land rights have you noticed for Indigenous peoples and youth? And in no particular order, whoever wants to take up this question.
Attended the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014, and each year after the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And since that time, what I've seen were a number of youth delegations come and make their case for justice. And as a youth at that time, I always thought, what can Indigenous youth here do together to develop programs of action? What types of innovations can they co-develop to bring about the best possible future for land rights and water rights of Indigenous peoples? And one of the things that I noticed was the need to ground a lot of the conversations that happen on a global level at the local and grassroots level in our communities. And so in our effort to develop the MKW Indigenous Water Decade, we brought together partner organizations, learned that there were many Indigenous peoples as individuals and organizations leading Indigenous water initiatives across research, water infrastructure, policy, cultural programming, and other social and political efforts to advance Indigenous water rights. And oftentimes, like within the UN system, we come here and there's often a lack of opportunities to close the isolation or the silos that these efforts might exist within. So then we see a need to bridge this Indigenous water map, these Indigenous water initiatives, to learn from each other, to see what we're doing together, to see what possibilities will then arise from that collective conversation. And since then, in the MKW Summit, we produced MKW Summit reports for each year that details and outlines a number of those collective innovations that were designed by Indigenous peoples and youth. And yet, we're at a point when we're realizing that many of these innovations, unlike the Western world, do not have the funding, do not have the support needed to carry them out fully. And in the Western world, what we see as a result of water colonialism are these Western and colonial water institutions that rose to prominence off Indigenous water theft. And so that's one of the sort of pinnacle realizations there that I'm seeing in some of my research as I look at global water institutions that continue to exclude Indigenous peoples and youth at all levels within organizations. And oftentimes when they produce reports, we're always a footnote. Indigenous youth are a footnote. And oftentimes their input is collected mainly for the reasons that are extractive, that mine Indigenous mines for the purposes of building the Western water paradigm and building Western institutions up. So The opportunities that I then see here are great, that Indigenous water justice and co-governance opportunities and innovations can then have a lot of space that have yet to be explored together. And we can do that together and make the best possible difference for the future of water at this time. And I don't see a need to wait for anyone's approval or to wait for any institutions. I see a need now for Indigenous peoples or youth together to put their minds together and see what innovations will surface, and then to do our best to carry those forward. And I think as these conversations grow, we'll see greater and greater opportunities from that generative movement that we develop together. So I'll say that much right now. Thank you.
All right, Wopila. And again, the question is, what types of opportunities for water and land rights have you noticed for Indigenous peoples and youth here at the UNPFII?
I think Wakíŋyaŋ said it pretty well. But some of the opportunities coming from my perspective as a grassroots and as a young person who kind of came here, that seemed by luck, and it just kind of grew. And it's an opportunity to broaden your perspective individually as a young person to even just learn about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think, when we talk about water and land, those are two fundamental pieces that are inherently grounded and are the foundation of our Indigenous law and natural law. And just saying that right there are the opportunity to be here led me to understanding what I just said. And broadening and deepening that understanding leads to how can you contribute to that movement, to that fight, to protecting Inama Koche, Makushin and Kushin, Grandmother Earth or Mother Earth, to protecting Miniwaka, the sacred water. And for myself, coming from Canada in Treaty 7, we have certain federal and provincial parks that removed our people from our traditional territories, where there are places literally called Miniwaka, which is a sacred water, a sacred lake. It removed us from those connections to what naturally contributes to our health and planetary health and individual health, community health, and that's really what the theme is here. And to be able to dive into that and voice the injustice and the violations that our people have faced, as so many people across Canada and the world don't know anything about that. And the history around, many places where our sacred sites on the land are on water that contribute to water. The history behind all of that, a lot of people, the general public, the general population have no idea some of the creation stories and connections that we carry to those places. And so to be able to come here and learn from other organizations, other youth, and many others, intergenerational leaders, really helps you to find a path that in many ways has been paved and some partially paved and some not at all. And to be able to navigate through that and build relations to really accomplish a more broader, complex goal that when you're at home and you're not at a place like this, it's hard to comprehend and utilize that knowledge when you feel so small in a community, grassroots. But when you come here, the opportunity really feeds into that system and that belief, again, to our traditional laws that we're all related. We all are facing issues no matter which part of the world. And I think that's so empowering. And that opportunity to work together and build relations for me to then bring home and utilize them there, but also utilizing them nationally with other Indigenous organizations or communities and across the globe, to me, are those kinds of opportunities. So it's really a very complex, but it's also, when we remember those natural laws in our traditional principles and values, that really helps us to translate some of the knowledge and information that's being given into a way that young people and youth can utilize it. And to me, that's a bit of the possibilities and opportunities that I see come here that relates a lot to education.
Right. So we're going to get into this third question, and we're a little interested about where you come from in terms of what you witnessed, your experiences, and the work that you've been involved in. So this question is, tell us about the water and the environmental work that you do.
Yeah, this is a really important question because, for a lot of us up here, the power is in our people and in our communities. And that's really what brought us here. And so when I think about my community and our waters, I come from Pine Ridge, and we have one of the, I'm sure it's very similar for a lot of places, but we have one of the worst health disparities in the Western Hemisphere. And so for me, my work started in trying to identify the source of those health disparities, and it's in our environment, and it's in the violation of our rights. And so with this work, what I do and what I have done is conduct water research, trying to find that source of where these contaminants and toxins are affecting our people. On the reservation today, there was a report in 2020 that mercury in our public drinking water is 8 times over the accepted EPA limit, and that's unacceptable, right? And so because of that, and I strongly moved by our ancestors and the laws and the treaties that they built for us, because they had that vision. We talk about climate crisis solutions. They had that vision 200 years ago. All of our treaties protect our lands, they protect our waters, and then they protect us because of that. And so a lot of it is all interconnected, and that's who we are as people, is seeing that interconnection and honoring that interconnection. And so when I think of my community, I think, our lives depend on it. And voicing those concerns, advocacy for us started with prayer. And now we're out here advocating in a different, in a way beyond that, or not beyond that, but to others. And so it starts with talking about it. It starts with understanding the interconnection, how it's all related. And it's really, planetary health is really what Indigenous people have always done. That was always our concern. And so that's how it's all connected. And it's really what drives me to be here and to voice those concerns. And also just to learn, learn about these processes, like relatives here who are passing that along, that makes a difference, investing in others and youth and learning how to successfully advocate is really important. So that's Petra too.
Oh, and again, the question was, tell us more about the water environmental work that you do, where you're from.
Yeah, I think I kind of answered a little bit of that in the last question. But what I really want to share is that, each territory across the country and across the world, we as Indigenous peoples, as Ampu said, we have these connections to the land and to the territory that ultimately defines who we are and where we come from. And therefore, the solutions in each territory will be different. And I think water really is that one area that I think many of the issues are very similar, but also at the same time, the answers to those problems show up differently. And so in my territory, in the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, we have the glaciers on top of the mountains that are being affected by climate change and are melting and heating the waters. And my community is called Minithni Wapta, or Minithni Oyade, which means cold water river or cold water nation. And it's about the Ijathibe Wapta, which is the Bow River. And when you think of that name, Ijathibe, as one of my tahas, my relatives back home Thomas Snow Jr., as I heard him speak recently, about how that river, Ijadibe bow, is really an actual bow that we would hunt with, and was a tool that we utilized to hunt and helped us feed the people, and that a lot of the willows that we use to make bows and arrows are along that river, and therefore when that pollution and the climate change is happening, we have very big floods that impact our community and those river basins and the kind of the edge of the water. I'm forgetting the word, but it really damages the land close to the river, and that affects us in that way. Meaning, our tool that helps us to feed our people is then being at jeopardy of loss, or is on the verge of losing that resource that really helped our community. And another kind of more modern issue in our area is really related to jurisdiction, where we have these federal and provincial parks, but then also municipalities along the river, because our river, Ijadibe Wapta, or Bow River, really comes from one mountain that's upstream, and it comes down into what they call now the Bow Valley, which is that same river, and it feeds into the city now known as Calgary, where I flew out of to come here. And a lot of that journey from that top of the mountain to the big city, there's all these jurisdictional boundaries, and each jurisdictional boundary has a policy and a set of rules and regulations that they follow to help govern their water resources. And our reservation is right in the middle of that. And so one person or one jurisdiction can implement policy and regulations to help provide better ways to preserve and protect water, while the other one more upstream is not doing anything about it, or downstream. And therefore, a lot of them overlap and are not, really picking up the work to support each other, even though it's the same bloodline, the same stream of water that's coming down. The other issue that we have in our territory is that all these jurisdictions really don't know what Indigenous water rights are, and to me, they are knowingly trying not to allow that definition to become a reality, because our Indigenous water rights have not been defined yet in my territory, and therefore there's a real opportunity and a real process that we have to then define it very clearly, to allow more protection, preservation, and conservation of water going downstream. Because to be honest, that water from the glaciers, it's not like more than 50% of that water is actually going north. We don't get a lot in the Saskatchewan River Basin, where my community is. And so to me, those are probably one of the biggest water issues in our community and in the environment. Again, really relate to what Ampu was saying with cultural awareness and understanding cultural connection to the land, because we've been removed from a lot of the places like mineral water that are sacred sites for us, that have stories of healing and protection, and that our youth ultimately feel the effects of that, because they're being robbed of that history and that information on how we're connected to this land, and really is that medicine that they need to understand that belongs to them, and we need to protect it together. Whereas the society we grew up in, it's almost that's a protected area, and you need a pass to go in there and enjoy a tourist experience, where our people, have a different story, and it wasn't a tourist location, that it was actually a sacred site. So we're kind of battling these many multi-layers of water, land and water issues that are both, related to jurisdiction and law, but also, impacting our cultural knowledge systems and helping our young people and community understand that. So those are, again, a bit of from my territory, some of the complex layers that we have to deal with and actually understand, first of all, how those work and how they're affecting our community.
I think what Daryl just said about what happens upstream happens downstream was a sort of a powerful understanding there. Oftentimes, I think what I've noticed is that Indigenous water issues are also transboundary water issues. What I mean by that is Article 25 in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain their spiritual relationship with their traditional or otherwise occupied waters and coastal seas. And what that means is that even in urban or metropolitan or other areas where Indigenous peoples aren't, those are still the traditional or sacred waters of Indigenous peoples and youth. And those types of realizations sort of give way to the thinking of MKW, Indigenous Water Decade. Oftentimes when I was learning from Indigenous water advocates or initiatives, what I learned was that Indigenous peoples and youth many of them held collective water governance systems, collective water democracies, or collective or commons. And what that means is that every Indigenous person and youth had a role in the future of their own water rights. What occurred with water colonialism, with the advent of settler colonialism, was the introduction of individualized and exclusive water management systems. And when that happened, Indigenous peoples and youth and their roles and traditional relationships to their waterways were disrupted. And some of this occurs more in different areas, but this is a global story of disruption to Indigenous water relationships and water rights that is still ongoing. It wasn't something that happened in the past, it's still happening now. And when we initiated the MKW Indigenous Water Decade and hosted a number of MKW summits, our hope was to surface a lot of those original teachings and the possibilities and innovations that could come from those conversations. Many of the recommendations that arose were for the global level as well and for Western water institutions to really question how water colonialism plays a role in their organizational identity and how and if they support Indigenous peoples and youth today. And I believe it was 2019, we spoke here at the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and we called on the UNPFII to develop a partnership with UN Water. Oftentimes, UN Water will host an annual conference, and they'll ask for global input, and so we provide Indigenous input into some of the water areas that we would like for them to focus on. And yet the whole system, the conference, really does lack in Indigenous representation at multiple levels within it. And we call on UN Water to increase representation, full, effective, and equal participation of Indigenous peoples at all levels of that water conference. And we call on UNPFII to also do the same and to support Indigenous water initiatives and coordinate cross conversation and communication across them so that we might learn from each other about how we are approaching certain water issues. And so one of the things that MKW is engaged in at this time, previously we had conducted a Native Youth Water Sovereignty Report and learned that there is this vast cultural relationship that Indigenous youth have with their sacred waterways and their traditional lands. And yet, this conversation has been undermined and understated by colonialism. And that's because when colonialism came, they imposed the concept of property. And from that arose terracentrism, land centrism. And the conversation became less about water identities and water cultures and more about terrestrial identities and what land rights are. And those are equally important as well. But we see a need to begin to surface and uplift Indigenous water stories, rights, and innovations that we see for the future. And so we come here this year to the UNPFII to call for greater investment into Indigenous-led water initiatives, to call for all global water institutions to question how water colonialism plays a role in its work. And also, what we seek to do is partner with Indigenous water organizations that are here today and invite them on Thursday at 1 p.m. to our parallel event here in New York City. And you can contact us here on the floor or reach us here on the UN floor to learn more about it. And we invite your partnerships to deepen our discussions around water rights and to find out what more we can do here at the UNPFI.
So I have an environmental engineering background, and I would not have accomplished that without prayer and without our traditional way of life. That's just it. And so what I do today and what I strongly believe is, suffering for knowledge or whatever that is, whatever goals or dreams people have, it's investing in their dreams, because their dreams combined collectively is going to build our future. And that's the way we need to see it, is every single young person is going to be a future change maker, period. It doesn't matter where they came from. It doesn't matter what they have. That's just in them. That's who they are. So supporting their dreams and whatever that looks like is really, really important. And for me, because I have these skill set, it's really important to pave that path forward and demystify what it means to even be an environmental engineer, demystify what it means to look at our water from that perspective. Because it's not a mystery. Our people are the original environmental engineers. That's just who we are. And so when I think about it that way, and the way I invest in youth right now, or my cousins and my relatives, because we're all related, the way I invest in them is I show them. I conducted this water research, struggled to find funding. I think there was a really important part where it was really hard to even have funding. And a lot of it came out of my own pocket, but, to keep going. And I took these youth from a local tribal college, and I taught them how to collect water samples. And I taught them how that's connected to our rights internationally and, just everywhere. And so, we have the agency, it's there. We have the willpower. We have all of that already. It's just the resources that we need allocated towards us. And so I think the biggest investment is investing in their dreams and investing just in youth. Every single one is a representative of their family, of a Tiushpai, of a nation, and wherever they go, we come behind them. And so that's kind of how I see it.
The question is thinking about future generations. In what powerful ways can Indigenous water movements involve Indigenous youth?
Yeah, I think, this question can be very different in many different levels. And for me, as Ampu said, thinking about the community and how much that traditional knowledge plays a role in our lives and that connection to the land and to water. And for me, my first reactions and steps are, I think creating projects and programs where youth get to work directly with water, as Ampu said, with the samples, but also, at a younger age, just going on water, with canoeing, and then allowing those traditional stories to come alive in relation to like how our people used to travel in canoes. I remember hearing stories of my my grandma, who made a type of boat out of birch bark from our community. And today we don't make those anymore. And to hear stories about a relative doing that makes me think, about our connection to water and how that role can really help shape my identity. And then also, I look at our program the Youth Council does with taking youth to make traditional bows that they harvest from the land, and hearing that story about Ija Dibe and the Bow River, again, are more educational pieces about stories that are not being told but shared, and really building that foundation of who they are and their identity as a good way to engage our youth and to get them started on that journey of advocating for our water. Because as Ampu said, connecting those knowledge systems and ways of knowing and being to international perspective and being a part of the international movement, as we'd say today, on more broader issues. And then from there, knowing how much our people face, they can then pick a career related to environmentalism, and being able to then be in those positions of power and policy changing and ultimately redirecting that funding stream to where we can continue to educate and empower our young people to then be change makers, which they rightfully have, but we're just not doing today because of those colonial systems that, again, are constantly pushing our people down. And so to me, that's one way to go into it. And again, seeing and investing in our young people, as Ampu said today, to me is probably the biggest thing to do, because they can be a lawyer, they can be a doctor, they can be a scientist, and they can be in those positions to make even more change, as we're trying to do now, as we're overcoming what they call intergenerational trauma, or trauma that was put onto our people by boarding schools or residential schools. And I believe our generation that are sitting here today, we have a bit of that in us, but it's the generation after that might not have some of those trauma components in their lives that just allow them to dream more and think bigger more and pursue more and allow more support as a family, as a Dagunchaye or to Yoshbaye, and be able to really be in that position to help. It really goes into that family system, which is a whole other topic in itself, but I'll stop there. And
just say a little bit about this question here. Part of the summit that Indigenous peoples and youth asked for was that a part of it be that they are on the water on a certain day. And so one of them that one day we picked in the summits is that we take the youth and the people that are attending on the water. And what we believe is that the canoe places us back into that sacred relationship with water. One of the things that one of our predecessors here at the UN once said was that we do not separate the creator from creation. Our spirituality is our reality. Something about Indigenous water rights is that spirituality and culture are dimensions of those water rights that might not be found within Western water rights systems. And so we have to treat those as equally as important in two different dimensions of water rights. And so we see a great need to invite Indigenous youth who are here at the UNPFII to attend our parallel event and attend the 2023 MKW Summit, and to help us build this water movement together. And I think that's what I want to offer on that question right now. Thank you.
All right, at this time, I want to say Wobila Kanka to Ambo Jensen and Daryl Kootenay, Wakíŋyaŋ LaPointe. I want to thank all of them for up here for their rich knowledge and experience and vision for our youth. And especially Ambo, I want to say Wobila for coming through today, because it's not lost on me that a lot of our Indigenous leadership that stewards our environment, our people spiritually, emotionally, are Indigenous women. And so today, before we go, our team is hosting the Wakíŋyaŋ Summit 2023, August 15th to 17th, and we invite Indigenous peoples, youth, and relevant actors to this Indigenous-led initiative and to support the water rights of Indigenous peoples. So with that, I want to say Wopla Kanka out.
Hi, this is Buffy St. Marie. I'm here to support public access and SF Commons in San Francisco. Be sure to watch Eagle and Condor, our Indigenous native show produced here in the Bay Area.